Good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Morse. I am professor and chair of physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Miami, and I am very pleased to be co-organizer of this symposium with Tay Netoff and David Darrow. We are very pleased to welcome you to a very exciting couple of days of discussion around neuromodulation, specifically in spinal cord injury. And there are a couple of housekeeping rules or reminders that I would like to bring up. Please turn your phones to mute if you can, turn your ringers off. And I was reminded that today we will have a special tornado warning test of our system. Not a tornado, but a test of our system. At 1:45, so you may hear tornado sirens. It does not mean that we need to seek shelter, so don't be alarmed. So I'm very pleased to invite Dennis Olson to open our session and to give opening remarks. He's the commissioner of the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, and he plays a very important role in neurotrauma research here at the University of Minnesota and in the state. He has been instrumental in securing state funding to support spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury research, and our community is really grateful for the support, and indeed much of the work and the interactions that occur here at this conference are due to his support. So in a moment I'll ask him to open the session. We have a very interesting keynote. The first keynote is on the history of neuromodulation, and that will be given by Dr. Denison. And then we'll go into our first session, Lessons Learned from Neuromodulation Translation, and that will be chaired also by Dr. Denison. Our second session will be after lunch, and lunch will be sponsored by our industry colleagues Onward. Thank you for that support. Session 2 will be brain-computer interfaces, and that will be chaired by Dr. David Darrow. Session 3 will be after our break, and this will be whole body syndrome, that is spinal cord injury, targets for spinal cord stimulation, and that will be chaired by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Klaus Lindman. Klaus, thank you for attending today. And we will adjourn at 6:30. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dennis Olson to give our opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning. As was just mentioned, my name is Dennis Olson, and I'm proud to serve as the Commissioner of the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. On behalf of the Walls-Flanagan administration, it's an honor to join you this year for this year's Neuromodulation Symposium. I want to thank our host organizations, the University of Minnesota Medical School's renowned Institute for Engineering and Medicine, and the MnDRIVE Brain Conditions initiative. These organizations are incredible assets to the scientific and medical community, seeking to create connections, advance research, and discover cutting-edge solutions. Looking around this room, and I've met a few folks this morning already, I see scientists and engineers and clinicians, practitioners, and of course, entrepreneurs. Each of you is here because you're passionate about neuromodulation and spinal cord injury interventions. You have dedicated your lives towards helping people, and I'm amazed at your work. My role at the Office of Higher Education is to support institutions like the University of Minnesota, advocating on their behalf, of course, so that faculty, staff, and students have the space and the resources necessary to thrive. Every time I have the honor to attend a symposium like this, I'm reminded really why I love my job. I got into the field of education because I believe in possibility. The possibility for people to achieve their full potential, the possibility for our state to be a leader in areas like science and medicine, and the possibility for academia and research to unlock the unknown. Just like me, I know you all believe in possibilities as well. Just look at some of the research being presented. And my apologies on these names, but I just loved finding some of these titles from folks here that are attending. Dr. Andrea Galvez in her research to use controlled spinal cord stimulation to restore walking after a spinal cord injury. Dr. Ricky Banerjee, who is developing a minimally invasive brain-computer interface platform. Or Minnesota's own Anthony Windebank from the Mayo Clinic, who is working to heal spinal cord injuries through regenerative therapy and epidural electrical stimulation. Every day, you work to turn medical possibilities into a reality. If there was ever a room of people poised to find a breakthrough or breakthroughs in spinal cord injury interventions, this is certainly it. Now again, at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, we certainly know how important this work is. That's why, as was mentioned in 2015, we worked with the state legislature to create the Spinal Cord Injury and Traumatic Brain Injury Research Grant Program. This grant program gives Minnesota institutions funding to conduct research that will lead to new and innovative treatments and rehabilitative efforts for people with spinal cord injuries and traumatic brain injuries. Initially, the grant program was supported just a kind of couple of one-off projects on a 1 or 2 year timeline. But as you know, this work takes time. It takes a lot of time. Which is why in 2020, just a few years ago, we expanded the program to give grantees 2 to 5 years to use the funds for their research. Grantees are reviewed and selected by experts in the field, as well as those that are impacted, including people experiencing spinal cord or traumatic brain injuries or their family members. And we also have ensured the panel of reviewers for research includes veterans as well. In our most recent grant cycle, we were able to award $1.4 million for projects around traumatic brain injuries and $1.7 million to support spinal cord injury research. Of course, I could spend the next whole session, I think, diving into the various studies that these grants are supporting, but I want to take a moment just to focus on why this work is so critical. Here's a testimonial from one Minnesotan, Jeff, who benefited from a study funded by the grant. When Jeff was 54 years old, he suffered a spinal cord injury while riding dirt bikes with his 2 younger sons. After 4 years of not being able to move his lower body, uncontrollable muscle spasms, neuropathic pain, and bladder control issues, he was accepted into an E-Strand study that received funding from our agency through this grant. Jeff says he cried after hearing he was accepted into the study. Being included meant the world to him. Because of this study, he was able to move his legs for the first time in 4 years. He saw his muscle spasms almost completely eliminated, and it gave him better control over his bladder. But most importantly, Jeff said the study gave him hope. Hope for an improved quality of life, not just for himself, but for everyone suffering from spinal cord injuries. We receive stories like Jeff's every year as we prepare a year-end report on the grant for the legislature. The work supported by this grant is just a small subset of the research and studies taking place, of course, here in Minnesota, but as you all know, across the nation. Each study has their own Jeff. Someone who wasn't sure if they would ever see an improved quality of life. But suddenly, as they move their legs for the first time in years, they see hope. This work, your work, is changing people's lives. It's making the impossible possible. I'm truly grateful my agency is able to offer this grant and other similar opportunities, and I hope it continues to play a role in supporting innovations and breakthroughs in this field. Minnesota is, of course, blessed to be home to so many leaders in the medical field, from the University of Minnesota to the world-class Mayo Clinic to homegrown companies like Medtronic. We are constantly striving to be a leader in fields such as neuromodulation and spinal cord injuries. But the reason I love symposiums like this is that they serve as a reminder that we're not alone. Each of you is part of a greater network. Gatherings like this allow us to share our knowledge, be inspired, and perhaps find a new collaborator. Together, you represent the future of neuromodulation and spinal cord injury research. I look forward to seeing what everyone in this room does next. You may not see me in the lab. Well, you won't see me in the lab. But please know I am 100% your advocate in this work. I will continue to share the countless stories, all of the Jeffs who are benefiting from your work, from your daily passionate work. So if you're simply visiting our great state, thank you for letting Minnesota be a part of your journey. And of course, if you call Minnesota home, thank you for helping to make our state the center of neuromodulation industry in the United States. I appreciate you letting me join you this morning. So honored to be here. Again, on behalf of the Walz-Flanagan administration, thank you so much. Have a good session this morning.
Thank you, Dennis, for those kind opening words. And I just want to express once again just our appreciation for what your office has done for spinal cord research in this area. And I've worked with Jeff, and it's just incredible. It's just how transformational that the stimulation has been for his life. So I would like to introduce Tim Denison. Tim is at Oxford right now, and he's also been developing a new device called Dynamo, but many of us have already worked with devices that he developed while he was at Medtronic, using the Percept device allows brain stimulation and recording, and I'm using it in one of my clinical studies. So Tim, I am always indebted to you and your work that you've done in developing new technologies for neuromodulation. So thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. It's good to be home. Thank you for the invite. Yeah, I was asked to speak briefly about the history of neurotranslation. So this is one perspective. So disclosures, I am not a historian, so I'm going to give it my view as an engineer, and especially as I get older, my target audience are actually students, and so I'm hoping to give you some takeaways on how I see the world. And I will be pulling extracts from a paper that's now in press in Nature Reviews of Bioengineering with Gerwin Schock and actually Kai Miller down at the Mayo Clinic. So let me get this here. I'm trying to get my timer set. So the schedule is a little wonky this morning, and so I'm going to speak probably until about 10 after, and then give you back some time by not going through this again to introduce our session. We'll get right to the speakers. The other thing, it's important, I do consult for a number of companies since going to the UK because I couldn't get access to Medtronic technology. Started my own little company, developing the Dynamo, and I'm a director at that company, and of course have shares. And then there's several investigational tools that we'll speak to, specifically Activa PC plus S, RC plus S, and Dynamo, that are not licensed for sale. They're for investigational use only. So the first lesson for the students is this is all team sport. So Tay's kind and says Tim developing systems, but I see Joel, I see Heather, I see Nate. There's actually, Greg Loxercamp's in the audience. One of our graduate students on RICO is here. It's actually really team sport, and that's going to be one of the key elements that I want to reinforce is the ecosystem that's required in order to build translation technologies. And then also I'd guide the students, think about how we can help in emerging markets. This has been where I've steered a lot of my efforts since going to Oxford, is saying how do we bring neuromodulation actually to a broader audience, not just for the top wealthiest countries in the world, and actually the most wealthy healthcare systems even in the United States. So the translation process, promise. The idea of brain tech has been around for a long time, and I like this little cartoon snippet. One day in Gotham City, Dr. John Carr is talking about his scientific experiment, and I believe my brain amplifier could increase man's mental power 100 times. But there's one ingredient that's still missing, and I haven't found out yet what it is. And this also, panel 2 is ethics. One uninvited guest, Victor Danning, I think is crooked ex-scientist. I didn't know you could be an ex-scientist. If I had that invention and could find the missing ingredient, it would make me super intelligent. Then I'd be able to loot the world. And so in all seriousness on translation, as I kind of like this cartoon, is we do think about what are the ingredients for translation. That's something I want to talk about from a historical context of what we've taken away, but also I'm going to speak a little bit to the ethics, and we're going to cover that in the follow-up panel. So as introduced already in the context of spinal cord injury, this is another perspective of the problem of just neuro disorders in general for the brain. These are very, very important problems in society today. So this is a snapshot of the EU numbers alone, number of millions of people suffering from a given disease at any time, the cost of coverage in euros, and the total aggregate costs. In the space of brain stimulation, where I've worked a lot, we have Parkinson's disease. We're starting to make toeholds into the epilepsy space, but there are all these other markets. So this is a massive problem for us as neuroengineers, as innovators to try to address. But even in the space of Parkinson's disease, it's woefully underpenetrated. So we need to think about what new technologies we might be able to bring to bear there. So thinking about history, I, as an engineer, like to think about life cycles. And so this is adapted from Uterbeck, who studies technology life cycles. So the performance measure, the dark line, is kind of the performance of a given technology. This is time going by on the x-axis, and then the rate of innovation. And what I want to point out is there's kind of 3 cycles within one given cycle. First, some discontinuous technology change occurs. So something miraculous is discovered in the engineering lab. That then kicks off major product innovation. But at the same time, there's an era of ferment, so fermentation. No one knows what actually the final product's going to look like. So you think about BCI today. We're going to hear about this afternoon. All these different approaches going on. I'd say for the students, think about this. We're in an area of ferment in some of our areas. What is going to be the right choice? As we start to lock that down, as the product innovation is defined, then we start to think about process innovation. How do we actually make it more efficient? How do we make sure that we can deliver something that's economically viable to the insurance companies and for our patients? And then we enter a realm of product innovation that's more incremental and kind of just continuing to do cost downs. Those of you who've worked in industry, this recurring engineering, making sure that you can actually keep getting more and more efficiencies, but less on the product innovation, more of just doing what you're doing more stably. And that's really where you get into incremental change and a dominant design. And so as you look for the students, as you walk around the major manufacturers, a lot of the historical designs look very similar. I'd say there's kind of a classic 2 by 8 channel bore, brain stimulator, and then now we're kind of just getting into that next era of ferment. But for a decade looking backwards, we're definitely in more of an incremental space, one could argue. So what are some examples? These are the cardiac pacemakers of discontinuous change. So what kicked it all off? The silicon transistor arrives. This allows us to actually go and replace vacuum tubes with a portable battery-powered system. Then new materials and battery innovations allow us to make this implantable. The advent of MIMS and other sensors allows us to build more adaptive, physiological responsive systems. My worldview, part of the innovation of the MRI-safe pacemakers is in silico modeling. So our ability to actually run millions of permutations at scale. We don't have to run a clinical trial. So that's another thing to reinforce. The innovations don't always have to be some piece of hardware or some technical widget. It's also the manner you go about doing things. And then getting to the more of the transcatheter pacemakers, I put an asterisk here because I don't know quite whether this is really discontinuous technology change or actually more of just a lot of little things that kind of beautifully came together as a system. And I think that's another way you can innovate, is you don't have to have one axis of technology being innovated. You can actually look across the board and integrate them together. Prehistory, before we get into history. There is a prehistory of neuro that is not necessarily something to be proud of, I would argue. And so at the same time that Earl, Walt Lillehei, great batch for doing the cardiac pacemaker with transistor innovations. Similar innovations were going on in neuro. This is Delgado putting a radio transceiver into a bowl. He was Spanish, so this is I have to admit, this is quite an impressive show of belief in your technology. That's him in the bull ring with a radio transmitter. So you can see the little antenna going up there, and then the bull is charging, he pushes his radio transceiver, and then the bull stops. And this is from the New York Times. And so this is right in that same advent when the cardiac pacemakers were also taking off. Then a book came out, of which I have a copy, and I would suggest any of you interested in neuropsych read it to learn from it. It was Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, and how we're all going to get radio transmitters implanted into our brains, and then the government would be adjusting the knobs to kind of keep us under control. And the field basically crashed. And there are others in Heath. The UK was also doing experiments. It crashed the field. And so I want to kind of start out a little bit with a sobering prehistory of let's make sure we don't repeat some of those mistakes as we get very excited about neurotech today. And I'll come back to this and we'll talk about this on the panel as well. My students pointed out, I was walking them through this presentation, I also need to acknowledge Taylor Swift, because I'm going to go through some eras, and then they point out, yes, the eras tour, so I'm going to give you my eras tour. And this is a bit of an artificial construct, so this is a model trying to make sense of things. This is not a linear translation of history. But I kind of think era one, if we superimpose the product, kind of the engineering technology cycle, before that, when we think about neuromod, there was a scientific breakthrough. And so what was that major, I call it the discontinuous scientific change that started to inform something that we might build a product from. And one of my favorites is the cochlear implant, because there was a clear understanding of the neuroscience, the way that the cochlea is mapped into different frequencies. Then electrical engineers, material scientists could create an electrode array, break out the frequencies coming in from an audio tone, map that to the cochlea, and then start to build basically a replacement part for damaged hair cells. This was not an easy road. I think that's another thing for students. Talk to the history. I had the pleasure of spending time with Graham Clark in Melbourne, and he could not get funding for his initial cochlear implant. He actually went to the train station and bus station at commuting rush hours to raise money for his funds. So he was out there with a can and a poster trying to raise money for his funds. So if I don't see you out at the train station raising money for your studentship, I'm not yet impressed. And so even the ones that are historical, you got to peel off the layers, and there's oftentimes quite a struggle behind it. But this has been quite successful. I'm going to come back to a point here in a moment. The other is, pulling from Block, the statisticians, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Another model that was quite transformative in our space in neuromodulation and spinal cord was Malzahn and Wall, thinking about the gate control theory. And then once this was proposed as a way of basically gating off pain signals, it was applied within a few years in terms of the first generation of spinal cord stimulation with Mortimer and the other neural engineers. And so this is another example of science and some model discontinuous understanding of the scientific basis for neuro then informing a product. So the missing ingredients. We could keep adapting this, but this goes back with an old colleague of mine from Medtronic, Kelly Way, where we think about what are the ingredients of success if we reflect on some of those. So one is, I put it in the functional realm of clinical necessity being clear, some scientific validity, technical maturity, but also, I'll put this economics in its broadest sense. The elements of, can we actually provide enough value to the patient at a cost point that's actually practical so the healthcare system can support it. And part of the reason I enjoy being in England with the NHS is I get £30,000 for every quality adjusted life year I provide. So I have a metric. I actually know exactly what I need to design to. And if you want to talk about healthcare economics and my views of the US, I'll meet you at the bar tonight. We can talk about reimbursement codes and my thoughts there. The other thing that's the workflow viability. So there's a way that you can practically set this up. A cochlear implant, there's a process flow that a technician can configure and optimize the design, and there's a clear regulatory pathway. And all of this is sitting on an ethical foundation. So one thing I want to reinforce in terms of patient engagement and acceptance is even the cochlear implant has a very rich history of debate on its application and the perceptions of the deaf community on its application and how they see it. And if you're interested in this and kind of how the patients, the consumers of the technology view it, I would really direct you towards the literature on cochlear implants. It's very rich. It's not, you might think and say it's obvious, people want this technology. That's presumptive, I would say, on our part. You really need to read their perspectives and understand it. Now we start to think towards other era, kind of the era two, is, well, once we have new technology, what does that enable and unlock as an opportunity for new science? This is from Freeman Dyson. This quote was used quite a bit by the NIH when they're kicking off the Brain Initiative, is that oftentimes scientific revolutions are driven by new tools and new concepts. So I think about the James Webb Telescope and the new discoveries that are coming out from that. You know, those are just these tools of science. And what can we do in this map to say these aren't just products, these are actually new vehicles for us with our clinician partners to explore clinical neuroscience and try to understand things. As Tay was saying, using the percept to explore new ideas. In his case, the paper was epilepsy that I was reading. One of my favorite projects, looking back at Medtronic, was working with Gregoire Courtine, who reached out to us and said, I really need a spinal cord stimulator that does X, Y, Z. It was an amazing list of requirements. Said, can't do it. But we could do ABC. And Nick Buse, who is a firmware engineer at Medtronic, recoded the system, worked within a team. See Dwayne Bourget in the audience, kind of working on different modifications, very focused modifications of that core product to enable the clinical neuroscience that was then applied in a series of papers, first in a non-human primate, and then working its way up into a human population. And so this is, a video courtesy of Gregoire, where we went in classic 565 paddle. We used an Activa RC because Gregoire wanted monopolar stimulation, and for the regulators, that's, of course, we had to then say it's not MRI compliant. So there's all this kind of trade-offs of the requirements of what you want. But with this, Gregoire was able to basically prove out his concepts in a very efficient manner, in a way that didn't require investing in new capital, a completely new device. And that's a calculus problem. I mean, we've come back to those constraints, is that there's a real challenge of, do I invest in this new technology? Well, is it going to work? How well is it going to work? Will the economics of it all pan out? So it's easy to draw the circle. The calculus of how you actually go about that optimization problem is really quite challenging. And this is where modifying existing devices can really be advantageous. I'd say the same thing goes for the first generation of brain stimulation systems, which are, for all intents and purposes, a modified cardiac pacemaker. Got the electronics sitting in the chest, the battery, the energy source. Instead of the electrodes routing down to the right ventricle, you route up to the neck, and then a stereotactic neurosurgeon places the leads. And one of the elements of history, which I think is interesting, is history can also be an anchor if you're not careful. And so Ben-Abid was exploring this, as well as some others, replacing what was historically an RF surgical lesion with a high-frequency stimulation pattern, and they call it the reversible lesion. But a lesion in and of itself is a static concept. And so I think it kind of anchored us into this notion of, well, we're replacing a lesion. Well, my friends, that electronic package, it's a miniature computer. We're not taking any advantage of what that computer can give if we're just giving this fixed stimulation. So, looking at our constraints, the advantage here of the repurposing of technology is that the regulatory pathway is very clean. And so in the case of Gregoire, we could create a dossier, a very contained change of an existing device, made it very economically efficient. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to try out an idea as opposed to tens of millions. And then, of course, the clinical necessity, I'd also say it's onward story to tell, and they will tell it later. But he's also explored and expanded beyond just restoring gait, but looking at blood pressure and other elements of what autonomic restoration that some of the spinal cord injury might need. And so that's the other advantage of these tools, is you can also refine exactly what's the clinical necessity that you're going to go after. So I have two, I call them friends, but they're also mentors who've had a disproportionate impact on my life. First is Hunter Peckham, and this was at the last talk I participated in before I moved to England for a while. And Hunter, in a moment of frustration, said, we need to innovate how we innovate. And Greg Worrell, when I met him for the first time at a seizure prediction workshop, when we were just starting to think about building devices with sensing, in a moment, he's just like, I don't know, when do we know when we know what we don't know? And so, and then of course, Rumsfeld also pulled it off, but I prefer to quote Greg. So this gets into thinking about a continuum. And that's, for the students and the innovators, I'd like to think about this as a takeaway message, that we go through these cycles. So my first paper was a thin film electrode array that sat on a cortex. Never gets cited. But then I read about precision neuroscience, which is all over the newspaper. And it's the same thing we were doing 30 years ago. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I just say these things come in cycles and waves. In a way, we were too soon for our time. We were not ready for that technology, so we did a few quick papers, and then went and sat on a shelf. But now, 30 years later, the time might be ripe. And so what can we do to think about this as a continuum of cycles as we keep iterating on this? And not just think about scientific insights that we're going to drive our technology, but what do we need to do, both in terms of product and process, to drive the future and really try to enable translation. This is how I'm going to wrap up the tech side. So I love the business of science, and one of the things taking place 15, 20 years ago when we were trying to unlock these problems for Greg of figuring out what we don't know in some safe manner was thinking about designing a research tool platform. And so the mechanism that we were applying was taking an existing neurostimulator platform, in this case the Activa PC, which was approved by the FDA and CE marked, but then putting a scientific instrumentation kit on top of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But the model, and it's intentionally driven as a feedback loop, is that a patient comes in for therapy, we'll guarantee that baseline therapy. But they can also opt into a clinical study. So they can choose to join in. We're not asking them to make any compromises. Then the researchers can unlock the scientific instrument inside. And then if we're successful, because of the digital technology we use, we can upgrade that device. And that becomes, in the future, the next generation therapy. There's a continuous feedback loop. Now, this idea of scientific payloads, it's kind of funny. It was initiated by the Brain Initiative, which actually, I think it was in a building down the street. There was the definition stage when they brought in the planning team for generation one of the Brain Initiative, what will it be? And it was on human neuroscience. And I had my approved slide deck from Medtronic, which was nice glossy images of happy people and patients. And then I was luckily at the end of the day, because Brian Litt stood up and was almost emotional talking about the opportunity, so neurologist at the University of Pennsylvania, to revolutionize neuroscience and treatments. And I called my boss at the time, John Lalonde, and said, if I present this slide deck, we will look tone deaf, like we've completely missed the opportunity. And he said, well, think of something. I trust you. And so the model we used was the thing about a device, because they're saying we have tens of thousands, now approaching hundreds of thousands of people with the diseases we're interested in treating. We have access to that nervous system. What if we can safely and ethically, reliably put in a capable instrumentation payload, like you have a rocket, and we're going to put this as a science payload, and the device will be the rocket. And that's kind of the model behind this. And what was NeuroPace has their, the RNS, they were looking at this as well to support the Brain Initiative. They've been really, instrumental in helping to drive this field forward as well, some of their concepts. Our block diagram with the team was really just that. It was an existing stimulator And bolted on top of it was a scientific instrumentation kit. You'd wake it up and you'd shut it down, and you'd be none the wiser when it was basically disabled, as well as some supporting tools for closed loop. And the regulators, that comes back to this for the students, the regulators liked it. We went to several pre-submissions, but the reason that they liked it was we would contain the risk of the science, and we did not then ask the patients to have to compromise their therapy in order to participate in research trials. And we'll come back to that in a bit. So that was the architecture that we chose. I always thought of it as the 3 steps of maturing the technology. The first was proving that we could actually use brain sensing at home, and this is really pioneered by Dick Ramsey at UMC Utrecht in his study in ALS patients, where he would use the implanted device with the cortical lead, look at the fluctuation of the rhythms, the field potentials over the cortex. As she gave permission to use her name, Annika would think about moving her right hand, and then we could measure in the beta region and the gamma region the fluctuations in those field potentials, and she could then control her click on her home computer. And there will be some long-term follow-up papers that are actually currently in press explaining her journey. So more to come on that in the next month or so. But that gave us confidence that the system could work at home. Then Enrico Opry is here, so you can get the full story from Enrico. This then paved the way for the next generation of exploration, thinking about using those signals to actually control a brain stimulator. So we get this idea of when resting versus when moving. And what Enrico and Aisha Gundes, Kelly Foote, and Mike Oken wanted to explore was whether they could apply this technology, measuring the brain signals, the local field potentials, and use that to adjust a stimulator in real time. And so this is courtesy of Enrico and Aisha. And this kind of shows an essential tremor subject. And they're going to start out by showing kind of their activities of daily living, such as pouring a glass of water from one cup to the next, and the struggles that they go through. And what's taped on their arm are actually inertial sensors to help to just get more objective measures. And then what the next panel is, now with the device operating in this adaptive mode, there's the raw signal channel from the motor cortex, power bands extracted, very similar to the ALS patient. And when those bands desynchronize during motion, so that's the red bar is aligned with the video, we can ramp the stimulation up, hand goes down, those bands bounce back, resynchronize, and then stimulation can ramp down. And so this was also tested over several months, and this started to give confidence that we could both sense signals in the presence of the brain as well as apply stimulation and really start to think about adaptive physiological adjustments. Now, there were lessons to be learned. I think one of the key ones, which I say shame, shame, shame on us as a community looking at history, is that there's a real-time clock inside of every device. It's incredibly reliable. People sleep. Most people sleep. And most people are awake. And maybe the way we're providing therapy when they're asleep versus awake should be dynamic. But we're not at all taking advantage of circadian rhythms and applying that. And so when Enrico was first testing this, one of the complaints of the research subjects was as they were falling asleep, the device was misfiring. And so thinking about sleep-wake patterns, it's a big miss when I look at the history, because we're seeing our patients in the afternoon. I joke at Oxford, we see them between lunch and tea time. And so all of our results are very much skewed to the peak of the circadian cycle of best motor performance. And the FDA actually gave us that feedback, saying, what happens if someone sleeps? What happens if they take a nap? Just to start out, what does the device do? So do think about your use case. Then the last step, and this is a video courtesy of Phil Starr, is thinking about, of course, devices and medications. And so this is a gentleman with Parkinson's right after they've taken their dopamine, and they can have the surge of both dopamine and stimulation. And so it's not an either or, but thinking about how devices and pharma interact with each other. And of course, NeuroPace has also explored this quite a bit, looking at how anticonvulsants are changing the electrophysical properties that they can measure in that device. And so in Phil's case, using these devices to build up the understanding of what's going on in brain networks as patients' states change, say from dyskinesia, so kind of uncoordinated motion, to no dyskinesia. And it's that ability, thinking about the history of doing chronic, real-world measurements from research subjects that can really unlock what should be the next generation of systems. And in Phil's case, he's thinking about it, I use that analogy of a thermostat and controlling your heater or boiler. You can measure that rhythm when someone's dyskinetic and use it to adjust the device accordingly. So I'd like to pause, showing that first generation devices and now the brain sensing systems that are out there and are being revolutionized. I'd say the future, from William Gibson, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And one thing that I just find amusing is that we get all these newspaper articles every day about one-off experiments. And the entire aggregate intracranial BCI implants we put in one day 20 plus years of other implants, with either RNS or DBS systems with sensing capability. And I talk to my friends who are at the business school, and they say, that's actually, you're not in the newspaper and you should be happy with that because you're actually becoming the standard of care. Nobody talks about, the dog biting the man. They talk about when the man bites the dog. But it is interesting in terms of, you have to check in your ego in this space because my point on this is when you're wildly successful as an engineer is when no one knows you're there. So that's my definition of a great engineer. So in terms of where we are today, thinking about the missing ingredients is the research systems, and actually all the companies now are starting to think carefully about how do they enable new research capabilities. That helps to streamline the regulatory pathway, explore workflow viability, and keep the economics safe while we're figuring out the functional restoration side of things. Now, one last point I wanted to make is thinking about the ecosystem. So the original Medtronic experience was Earl Bakken basically repairing electronics for Walt Lillehei, and so the engineer working intimately with the clinician to understand the need and get very fast iterative prototyping. And I'd say for us as a community, perhaps we're a little bit too siloed, or at least it would have you ask that question. It's like we are working, now these are complex problems, but are we working a little too siloed? The next generation of systems also ended up creating quite a bit of innovation when it came to the way that the science is being coordinated. So in terms of the Summit RC+S, which is another investigational tool supplied by Medtronic for the Brain Initiative, it broke the system. And so we provided APIs, so application programming interfaces, so the researchers could program the device and set it up. They had to submit their regulatory dossier to the FDA. That's a big ask for an academic community. And so Phil Starr said, I don't even know where to start with this kind of investigation. He called Greg Worrell at the Mayo Clinic. And for me, what changed and was signaling a culture change was that Phil actually started sending his basically equivalent of the investigator brochure, his research ethics applications, and everything to other researchers, something I'd never seen before. And so it started to drive this whole open community of researchers and everyone partnering together to build the next generation of systems. And then within the United Kingdom, we teamed up with a small company and basically went in, this is highlighted in orange, because we said, hey, you've got a circuit board inside of there. Will you let academics go in and start to actually prototype this next generation of needs for research and just give us access to this? And so this is one step even beyond where the students and the postdocs have access to the hardware and the firmware and the software. And about every 2 weeks, there's a push-out cycle. And the academics and the clinicians are actually giving real-time feedback on the capability of the research tool and then applying it in studies. And so I worked at a large company. I can see there's risks associated with this. You don't necessarily want to send out all your files to just a bunch of academics. They don't seem to understand IP and some other firewalls as much as they should. But it is manageable within, if you put in the appropriate guardrails, it is a manageable kind of ecosystem that you can drive. And we've had some success. We have four brain therapy trials going on at this time among all of our kind of academic users in England. So to wrap up, last few minutes, thinking about history, let's not repeat history in all cases, or try to avoid it. And so here are some of the dragons. So this is the bridge in Bristol. I'd love to take you there. It's designed by Brunel, who also designed the railroads, and in southwest England, he designed many steamships. He was quite an innovator about a century ago. And one of the things that makes me sad on social media is this debate about, oh, that's incremental. You know, we did this in the neuroscience lab 20 years ago. This is old science. Well, is it incremental, or is it actually careful systems engineering? So doing something where a socket's coming out of your head and you're hooked up with a bunch of postdocs running it in a controlled clinical environment is very different than having something fully implanted and operating in a home environment. And so I would ask, and just for students to reflect, go back to that process map. There are all kinds of different people doing different tasks, and we all have to respect each other based on where they are on the journey. And so there is a role for process innovation, and it will not necessarily get you into nature, but it's important in terms of translation. Another thing about history, and this is a little snapshot from our figure from this upcoming paper, is the chasm that we have. And so the chasm is this historical leap between the early adopters, visionaries, and enthusiasts, and then the pragmatists. And so what's interesting for me is that the curve is around 15% is where they say it's the visionaries. And when you look, where's DBS today kind of sometimes stuck? Yeah, right around 15% in terms of its addressable population. And so making this leap, you go from a mindset to people who are like, wow, this is really cool. It's like brain stimulation. I can write papers on this. The community neurologist in England does not care about writing papers. They care about treating their patients in a very efficient manner. Same thing I'd say for the community neurologists in Minnesota and across the United States. And so we as a community as well, as we're thinking about history and translation, many of the ideas that went across and became pragmatic were not always the most complex designs. They're actually just very straightforward to use and had very sound economics going with them. So two final issues that I see arising, and I wink at my NIH colleagues for this because I think we're all part of it with the BRAIN initiative. N of 1 studies have become all the rage in terms of get your first cool result, rush off and publish it in Nature, and then move on to the next Nature publication. We are struggling to get the fully controlled trial that really tells us how well the therapy is going to work in practice. And so Peter Thiel has 0 to 1, and I say, my challenge is I don't care about 0 to 1, I care about 1 to the NHS. And I think that's something for us as a field that we also need to face into from a historical concept. And we're in a bit of a struggle because there's a lot of challenges right now in terms of trying to get your publications out there and do a high profile. So we're facing this on a pain study. We have 30 patients in a chronic pain study. It's going to be 6 years before we're ready to write a publication. We're going to be scooped on a bunch of small studies that come out with a quick biomarker. And that's just a challenge for us as a community to face. And the last one is just issues arising of being cautious of bridges too far. And so there are several examples in the recent literature from Second Sight with the retinal implant, the NeuroVista system being explanted, the view of the research subject saying it was an amputation from their perspective when it was pulled out. And so we need to face into, as a community, how we take care of research subjects in the long term, make sure they have access to the technology. In my own research, I think a lot with the Dynamo. We're treating pediatric epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut children. They're 5 years old, and I'm not being dramatic, just statistically, they will outlive me. And so we were thinking about how do we actually make sure that there are the safeguards in place so that the people who are basically signing up to test out our technology are going to be cared for in the long term. And there will be a paper coming out on this shortly from a Royal Society meeting that we had, kind of giving some thoughts on neurotech abandonment and some best practices. So just to wrap, this is what the bridge looks like today. And as a little aside on history, it's kind of fun. The Oxford Dangerous Sports Club brought bungee jumping to the mass audiences by dressing up in tuxedos and bungee jumping off this bridge for the first time. So that's a little side note of just from bringing back from home to Minnesota. So I think we can all agree this is a problem worth the effort. There are massive unmet needs. A lot of focus this week is on spinal cord injury, but there are a number of different disorders which could benefit from pushing forward the neurotechnology. Thinking of a translational mindset, we really need to solve a fairly complex calculus problem of multiple constraints. And so I'd say don't see this as a challenge or an obstacle, see this as an opportunity. This is where you can actually be very clever as an innovator. And how do you actually systematically go about resolving these intermixed constraints and ultimately get them balanced to a level that's required for a therapy to be brought to the market and made available to patients at scale. Part of that for me is really thinking carefully about the ecosystem. And like I said, this is my approach. It's not the right approach. It's just the way I've chose. I just have you think about how can you come up with your own methodology. I think a lot of this is thinking about the research tools and the process innovation, where the process is working with the regulators and the clinician and the workflows so we can actually push out these new translational models in a systematic way. There are trade-offs. So this is incremental. So you're basically bootstrapping off of existing technology. So you have to be willing to sign up to be the tortoise, and the tortoise versus the hare race, because it's hard to get grants when you're actually using this kind of incremental approach, when they want to see more electrode counts and the like. So everything you do will have its trade-offs. So my closing thought is from another Midwesterner who chose to move to England and live in Oxford for a while, is to reinforce the cycles, we will not cease from exploration. But he was really driving home the idea that life is a continuous process. And when we all end all our exploring, it will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So with that, we'll take a 5-minute pause and then start the panel. Thank you.